So now in the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, Amen. Paul says, grace and peace be unto you. I don't think that's exactly what they wanted to hear, in all honesty, this nascent Christian community in Corinth, because by and large, they were actually a pretty cantankerous lot. So I don't think grace and peace was really high on their list of priorities. Corinth was a wonderful metropolitan area. People from all over the known world lived and did business in Corinth, so you would have experienced people who wore all kinds of different dress, ate all kinds of different foods, believed in all kinds of different faith traditions, and all of that diversity lived in the middle of Corinth, and all of that diversity was part of the early Christian community that got formed there. And as a consequence of that, they were a pretty cantankerous lot. It was all about, well, I'm right, thank you, and you're wrong. And I know what's best, and you don't. And I know God better than you do. And oh, by the way, I know how to do liturgy better than you do. Sound familiar? So the notion that Paul writes to them and extends them grace and peace for this very diverse, cantankerous lot, probably not the thing they were most anxious to hear from Paul. Probably what they were most anxious to hear was, oh yeah, you're right and you're wrong. But that's not what Paul does. Paul extends instead, the very first thing out of his mouth is the notion of grace and peace. Of course, the church is not the only environment in which diversity reigns and cantankerous opinion and behavior reigns. The church is but one place where cantankerousness can preside. For Jesus and his disciples today, they have crossed the valley and are on the Mount of Olives, and they are looking over their beloved Jerusalem. As they look over their beloved Jerusalem, they recognize great diversity in that city as well. Diversity of all sorts and kinds, and the very uneasy, edgy potential for violence to erupt at any time. When they look at their beloved Jerusalem, they know that they are in a place where that kind of divisiveness and diversity and cantankerousness can happen and explode at any moment. And the truth of it is that they probably by now recognize that Jesus will not be long for this world. That they understand at this point that Jesus' words and actions in the midst of that edgy place of barely contained cantankerousness puts him in a position where he himself will probably not live for very long. And if the disciples were true to me, I suspect they were scared, they were anxious, they were concerned, and they felt overwhelmed. The notion of grace and peace in the midst of that situation must have felt like such a foreign possibility to them, as it did to Paul with his church in Corinth. The truth of the matter is that from my perspective, not only is that true in Corinth and in Jerusalem, but it's just as true in the world that we live in today, is it not? Does the world not occasionally just feel to you really cantankerous? That in all of our diversity and in all of our differences, we are just by and large a cantankerous world where it really is all about I am right and you actually are wrong. I know better than you do, because most of the time I do. But it seems so pervasive in the world that we live in that the notion of cantankerousness seems to prevail, just seems to prevail. Whether it is in the Middle East, whether it is in West Africa, whether it is in Ferguson, Missouri, or whether it is in Baltimore, Maryland, how easy it is to feel that in our differences, we are just a cantankerous group of people. So the question that we ask ourselves today is, where is God? Where is God in the middle of this cantankerous, divisive, always edgy opportunity for violence to erupt? Where is God in the middle of that? What I suspect for most of us is the deep desire is that the God that we know has acted in history in mighty ways will show up again. That the God who took slaves out of Egypt and got them through the wilderness will come back with that kind of force and that kind of energy. That somehow or other God will do something mighty, something miraculous. And so, like the prophet Isaiah, I suspect in one way or another, most of us have found on our lips that moment when we look up at the sky, although that's not necessarily where God lives. We look up and we say, Lord, where are you? Where are you, God, in the midst of this cantankerous world? Where are you? We need you. We need you to rip open the heavens and come down here again with fire so hot it will boil water and mountains will shake, so that once again there is no question that you are here. Have you ever longed for that? Have you not just, in the sorrow and the sadness and the anger of living in a cantankerous world, just longed for that one moment when God might just show up and shake us all out of that and pull us back together? That moment where the heavens literally rip open and God shows back up and does something utterly miraculous. And Jesus says to us, "You're going to have to be more patient." Jesus says to us, you're going to have to be more patient. And instead, you need to stay awake. You need to be alert. You need to stay awake. Because what Jesus is talking about today is that the God we really need is not the God of mountain shaking, heaven ripping, fire boiling water God. That the God that we look for today, that we most yearn for, is the God who will be present with us in our cantankerousness, in our divisions, in the ways that separate and divide us and lead us up always to that edge with the potential for violence. Jesus says it's not the miraculous God that we need. It's the God that we need to stay awake and be alert for, that already resides within our midst. How hard that is. How hard that is to be awake and alert and to wait for the recognition that that is the God who is in our midst. But the truth of the matter is that God has already done that thing that we most require to remind us of God's power in this world. Not a heaven-ripping or fire-boiling or mountain-shaking reality that we think we are looking for, but an act that did rip heavens, boil water, shake mountains when Jesus died on that cross, that you and I might know that God is right in the midst and in the presence of our most cantankerous, divisive, violent capacity. That is exactly where God is. That is exactly where God is. And Jesus says, stay awake, be alert, Look for that God. Not a God who is somehow or other distant and just shows up episodically, but a God who has already done that act that reminds us that no matter how cantankerous you are or I am, no matter how divisive we are, no matter how many times we step up to the edge of violence and occasionally dip over it, that God has already stood in the place of utter violence and said, I will be your God, and you will never, ever be alone. And it is in that act that you and I can begin to find the truth about God that takes us beyond our cantankerousness, beyond our divisiveness, beyond our edginess, and frankly, beyond the ability that we have to slide sometimes so easily into violence. It is that God, that act, that takes us to a place of grace and mercy and peace. If we want peace, if we want a sense of grace in this world, Jesus says, stay awake, be alert, look for the God who stood in the midst of violence and said, I will take all of it on my body that you might know it will be redeemed. Now that's a God worth staying alert for, isn't it? That's a God staying awake for. That is a God worth waiting for. That is the God that we worship. And that is the God that invites us to dig deep down into the depth of who we are, to recognize the power of ourselves as God's people, that the things that we are not subject to the things that divide us, but we are, in fact, delighted by the things that can bind us. And isn't that noise a wonderful noise? Isn't that a gift to us today? Yeah, because it reminds us of what we have, the gift of joy and the gift of reliance on God and the gift and power of a God who redeems us all, young and old, liberal and conservative, Christian and Muslim and Jewish. Our God is a God who will redeem us all and took on himself every inch of violence that we're capable of and said, I will break its back. So stay alert, people. Stay awake. Look this Advent for the God who is right there next to you, and be blessed accordingly. Amen.